My name is Ben Thrash. I'm an extension entomologist at the University of Arkansas Division of Agriculture. And today I'm going to be presenting you a lot of common insects that we encounter in soybean fields in the southern United States. This is by far not all inclusive. It'd take a really long time to cover every insect pest that we encounter, in the southern U.S. in a soybean field. But this will help get you familiar with a lot of the ones that we're, more commonly encounter. All right. So, in the southern U.S., we don't have near the amount of soybeans that there are up in the Midwest, but I generally focus on this Delta area. A lot of the insects that I'm familiar with are within, Arkansas, Missouri Boot Hill, Tennessee, Mississippi, Louisiana, and within that Mid-South region, we have a lot of similar insect pests throughout this region. And I'll get into that a little bit more here in a little bit. So, this is a pretty good list of a lot of insect pests that we encounter in the southern U.S. We break them down into different categories. This is root feeders, stem feeders, sap feeders, defoliators, and pod feeders. And again, this is not an all-inclusive list, but it's a lot of the common ones that we run into issues with throughout the growing season. And I'm not going to cover every single one of these pests either. But we'll get started kind of with the root feeders because those are typically when they become an issue. It's first thing in the growing season. Um, just generally what insect pest we run into throughout the growing season. Corn earworm is our number one insect pest in Arkansas. It's a little bit different between the different mid-south states on which one is the main insect pest throughout the growing season, depending on the year. But corn earworm overall is our most consistent, most damaging insect pest in the southern U.S. Stink bugs, depending on the predominance of red-banded stink bug throughout the year, sometimes that can hop into number one in a really bad red-banded stink bug year, but it doesn't happen that often. Soybean looper is a really devastating insect pest. It can be during certain years. And so corn earworm, stink bug, soybean looper are typically our top three problematic insect pests of soybeans in Arkansas. And I would say for my surrounding Mid-South states, that's pretty similar for them as well. Bean leaf beetle, armyworms, and velvetbean caterpillar are kind of your next three that we generally encounter. So kind of getting started, Grape colaspis. We have the adult over here on the left side. It's kind of that goldish brown beetle, and you can see it a lot in cornfields. You'll see it in soybean fields, and a lot of times you see the adult. But what you don't really encounter is the larvae, just a whole lot. And that's actually the most damaging stage of this insect pest is the larvae, and they feed on roots of plants of the soybean plants and then stunt their growth throughout the entire season. And really, the only way to provide control of this insect pest is through insecticide seed treatment. So, kind of if you discover their injury after you plant, there's really nothing you can do for the crop that year except maybe in the future you might have to use an insecticide seed treatment. But this is an example of the damage that they cause. You see some pruning of roots down here. See how short those roots are, and they really just clip a lot of those roots off. Deep tillage doesn't typically work for them because they overwinter really deep in the soil profile, and then when the soil starts to warm up, they move farther up closer to the surface. And so, digging around during the winter, you're really not going to do a good job of finding them. It's only when the soil temperatures actually warm up and they come closer to the surface that you're going to be able to actually find those larvae. And they typically occur out in spots in the field. this is the same spot in the field where I had taken this previous picture, and these plants are just farther along throughout the growing season. But you can see those plants never recover from that injury that occurs later on or earlier in the growing season. And so, this used to be a lot larger problem in Arkansas before the widespread use of insecticide seed treatments on soybeans. Now it's more rare, but they still do pop up from time to time. Three-cornered alfalfa hopper is probably one of the most common insect pests that we see in a soybean field in Arkansas. I mean, you'll sweep up, 50 on a set of 25 sweeps in a soybean field, but they really don't cause that much injury. You see up at the top, those are the nymphs. You see they don't have any wings like the adult stage does down here in the bottom right corner, but they're pretty similar in shape. But really, both of these growth stages are what causes the injury on young soybeans. Typically, where three-cornered alfalfa hoppers are the most problematic is on soybeans that are less than 10 inches tall. So this is kind of when you need to focus on finding this insect pest out in the field or pay attention to them. Generally, when soybean plants get over that size, they don't tend to lodge from their injury. So that's why whenever they're really small, that's when you need to really focus on finding these. And what happens on these short soybean plants is they girdle the stem and they'll fall off. You can see this is some over here on the right side. This is some injury that happened earlier in the season where they girdled these stems, and you see these swollen little spots on here where soybean plant, if it was younger, could really snap off, and you could get some issues there. This is, an example of some small soybean plants that were impacted by three-cornered alfalfa hoppers. This was planted behind a vetch cover crop. It was planted into it green, and then the cover crop was burned down, and those three-cornered alfalfa hoppers hopped over on those small soybean seedlings and caused them to lodge. They girdled that stem, they lodged. Those plants never really recovered from that injury. Bigger plants, we don't worry about them. And I've always given this example on, why not to worry about them. Because people will pick up them and, may pick up 100 in a set of sweeps. And it's really concerning seeing that level of that insect, out there. But I don't recommend treating for them because, I had a fellow graduate student when I was in grad school at Mississippi State, and he was doing some work on three-cornered alfalfa hoppers, and where we were collecting them and we were putting them in this 6-foot by 6-foot cage. And we collected like 600 or 1,000 or something, and we put them all in one cage. An experiment, and we left them in there, and we came back, a week later and checked out the plants. And I'll tell you, at the end of the growing season, when we harvested those plants, there was no difference in between having, a plot with 1,000 within a 6-foot by 6-foot space on, big soybeans. We caged these on big soybeans, and where we didn't have any at all. And so that really convinced me that these are not a pest of soybeans once soybeans, get some size on them. Dectes stem borer, this is one that we'll get a fair amount of calls on, and they really don't cause any direct yield loss. It's a longhorn beetle, and you can see it's very distinctive the way it looks. I mean, it's a fairly good sized beetle. It has these long, really distinctive antennae. There's really nothing that you're going to find in a soybean field very commonly that looks like this. The larvae is kind of the stage that you got to look out for. So this beetle, lays an egg on the petiole of the soybean plant, and then those larvae bore into the soybean stalk and they'll tunnel up and down the stem. It's generally really difficult to control this pest if you want to, try any control for Dectes stem borer. But the big thing is they don't cause any yield loss. The issue that you can run into with Dectes stem borer is plant lodging. That tunneling up and down the stem, surprisingly, does not cause any yield loss. It looks bad. We've had studies where we've had over 100% infestations of Dectes stem borer in plots. And I say over 100% infestation because sometimes there was multiple larvae per stem. And then we've had, insecticide treatments that aren't labeled anymore, where we had 100% control. No yield difference between those plots. And matter of fact, just numerically, where we actually had the seed treatment, they actually yielded, it actually yielded lower than the untreated check. So that again tells me that that's an insect that really doesn't need to be treated for. Our general recommendation a lot of times is just try to harvest those beans, first. If you have a field that's got a lot of Dectes stem borers in it, just try to harvest that field first, to try to prevent any lodging. There's no direct yield loss kind of associated with it. And this is an example of that damage. You can see this boring up and down the stem where these snap off. These, if you walk out into a soybean field, you'll see these flags, is what we call them. And that's just where these stems, died, these petioles died. And that's because the egg got laid on these petioles, and then the insect bored into these stems and then tunnels up and down the rest of the plant. So pretty distinctive insect pest, not really something you need to spend a lot of time worrying about, but you'll probably come in contact with it. Bean leaf beetles, these are another insect pest that you'll find quite a lot of in a soybean field in the South. They're pretty common, but they've got several different color phases. They can either have spots, not have spots. They can be this red color. They can be this kind of a tawny color. They can be kind of more of a brown color. They can be gray in color. But the key identifying characteristics on bean leaf beetles, how to distinguish them from some other insect pests out there, is they always have this triangle up here on their back. And so if they have that triangle, it doesn't matter how many different spots they have, they always have this triangle on their back. So that's kind of the key identifying characteristic for bean leaf beetle. This insect does vector some different pathogens, and so they can be problematic in some areas. So that's something to kind of keep a note of for you if you start finding some of these. Typically, whenever we run into issues with them in Arkansas, is whenever they get in really, really high population on soybeans later in the year. They can cause quite a bit of defoliation. You can kind of see up here in the top right corner of this sweep net what we call shot holes. And that's really indicative of their feeding, is they feed these real circular holes throughout the season. And if you get enough of them out there, those little shot holes can really start to add up to quite a bit of defoliation out there. But as you can see in this net, I mean, there's all different colors. Some of them have spots, some of them don't have spots, but all of them have that triangle on their back. You can find them early season on some beans. This is just the difference between some having an insecticide seed treatment over here on the right side versus not having an insecticide seed treatment over here on the left side. And so they do a pretty good job of controlling them. But those soybeans will generally recover from that little bit of defoliation early in the growing season. Another thing, they're not just defoliators. If they get in high enough populations, later on in the growing season, they will start to feed on soybean pods. And they don't generally they don't feed on the seed. They actually just feed on that external, outside of the pod wall. And what that does is that really doesn't directly cause a lot of yield loss. They can do a little pod clipping if they'll start to feed up here where the bean pod connects to the rest of the plant and cause some beans to start falling off. But directly, this feeding on the outside of the pod doesn't cause any real yield loss. What it does happen to do, though, is let pathogens pass through into that pod and can cause some other issues from secondary, infections of different diseases in there, and really reduce quality, seed quality. Blister beetles, they're occasionally a pest in the South, and really they seem to be more problematic in drier years. That's typically whenever we see these blister beetles. And there's several different species. The predominant ones are black blister beetle, striped blister beetle, and margin blister beetle. And you can kind of see they all have a similar body shape, but they do have different colorations just between the different species. They've got a pretty interesting life cycle. The larvae actually hatch whenever they hatch out. They'll climb to the top of flowers, and they hitch a ride on the back of some ground nesting bees' backs, and they actually ride them back to their nest, and they're parasitic, and they actually feed on the eggs and larvae of those ground nesting bees. But then once they hatch out, once they become adults, they will they can cause defoliation out in soybean fields. And typically it's not widespread throughout the entire field. You see little pockets of blister beetles out there in the field. There may be a hole out there in the middle of a soybean field the size of a pickup truck that just is covered with blister beetles. You'll see some. I'll show you another picture here in a second of some really heavy densities of blister beetles. But that's typically how they occur. It's little spots out in the field. Just because you have one little hole of them out in the field doesn't mean they're going to spread out all throughout the rest of the field. So a lot of times spot sprays will take care of them. But why are they called blister beetles? Well, they secrete a chemical called cantharidin. And what it does is it can really cause some issues on some folks. And you see down in this picture in the bottom right corner, this guy actually had a blister beetle land on his neck, and I believe he swatted it and it crushed it, and that cantharidin caused those blisters on the back of his neck, and they secreted out around their leg joints. So just in general, this isn't really an insect pest you want to handle. If you got blister beetles out there, take note of them, but don't pick them up and play with them, or they can cause some nasty chemical burns on you. They're also problematic on horses in alfalfa. Horses are very susceptible to this cantharidin. If they're like in an alfalfa field, or if you have anything grazing, maybe some soybeans or something, horses are very susceptible to this. So if they actually eat just a few blister beetles, it can actually end up killing that horse. So just take kind of note of that with, if there's any livestock grazing and you see some blister beetles, it's kind of something to take note of. This is an example. This is kind of a picture taken long ago of how blister beetles, you'll run into them in the field, and these extremely high densities. But like I said, a lot of times it'll be just like a spot the size of a pickup truck or two out in the middle of the field. And you can typically spot spray, a little area like that, and get rid of them and get rid of your issue. So before we get into some of these caterpillar insect pests, I just kind of want to go over a little bit of the way to ID some different caterpillars. So prolegs are really what I want you to focus on in this image. This is how what'll help to ID a bunch of different caterpillars. different caterpillars have different numbers of prolegs. And I'm not counting this pair on the very rear, this anal pair of prolegs. I'm counting the ones in front of that. So all insect caterpillars will have 3 sets of true legs, and that's the ones whenever they turn into adults or moths. Those are the legs that they'll keep. These prolegs, they don't keep them as they turn into adults. But as we'll go throughout this presentation, I'll show you some examples of some different insects that have, some insects only have 1 set of prolegs, some have 2 set of prolegs, some have 3, some have 4. And that's kind of an identifying characteristic that'll help you out IDing some of these caterpillars. So green cloverworm, this is a really, really common caterpillar that you'll see out in soybean fields in the South. Almost every soybean field, you can find some green cloverworms if it hasn't been treated with an insecticide, because they're extremely easy to manage for. They've got 3 pairs of prolegs, 1, 2, 3. As you can see where these arrows are down here. And they've got the same looping movement as soybean loopers. So a lot of people will call these loopers, but they're really not true loopers. And their feeding habits are a lot different than soybean loopers. One identifying characteristics of green cloverworms, besides the prolegs, is that whenever you touch them, they thrash really violently. So they'll just thrash around trying to get away from whatever is coming in contact or trying to get them, and they'll fall off to the ground just trying to get away from whatever might be attacking them. And so we actually a lot of times don't even consider this an insect pest in soybeans, because they really eat, they'll occur in high numbers, but they really eat a very little amount of foliage off of soybean leaves. So they're defoliators. They are only going to feed on soybean leaves, but they really don't eat that much. And they provide a lot of food for predators and parasitoids. So a lot of times we actually consider these almost beneficial, just because a lot of different predators and parasitoids will eat these, and they really ramp their numbers up, and then are able to control some of these other more serious insect pests. As far as damage, like I said earlier, they're foliage feeders. So they just eat holes out in these leaves, a lot of times in between the veins on these leaves. And they generally don't eat a whole lot unless they get in some really, really high populations. Then you may end up having to treat for them. Although it's pretty rare in the South to have to treat for this pest, just because, like I said, they don't eat it just a whole lot. They are really easy to control. Most insecticides will actually control this pest. So, not really something serious, but it's something that you're going to come in contact with a lot of times in a soybean field. However, soybean loopers, this is what a lot of people get that green cloverworm confused with, is the loopers. Now, loopers, on the other hand, can cause a lot of injury. And you see up here in the top right corner what this moth looks like. So that's something you kind of want to keep an eye out for. If you start kicking up a lot of these moths, you might keep an eye out for loopers in the future in your field, and just be on the lookout for them. A lot of times if you catch some of these, you can see these 2 spots right here, which are pretty characteristic of soybean loopers. So the 2 loopers that we have in Arkansas are cabbage looper and soybean looper. Cabbage looper generally occurs a little bit earlier in the season than soybean looper. But soybean looper is really the one that causes the vast majority of the injury on soybean plants. And you really can't tell the difference between them. I know if you look at these pictures, the soybean looper has black true legs, and cabbage looper has green true legs, if you look at these pictures. But that's not 100% characteristic between these. More soybean loopers do have black true legs than cabbage loopers, but it's not 100%. So really what you have to do is if you are catching loopers out in the field, you have to treat them all as soybean loopers. You just count them all as soybean loopers because soybean loopers are resistant to a bunch of different insecticides, and you really in the field can't tell which one's which between the two. So you got to treat them all as soybean loopers. Um, typically these occur later on in the growing season. Typically when soybeans, get into R5.5, R6 growth stage is a lot of times when you see them later on in the growing season. They typically don't occur before, August. And they can really end up doing some damage really quick, as I'm about to show you in the future. Again, these are defoliating insects. They skeletonize leaves, so you can see they eat all the foliage between a lot of these leaf veins. And what's kind of interesting about soybean looper is that with pretty much every other defoliating insect that you come in contact with, they start feeding on the top and moving their way down. Soybean loopers will actually start feeding at the bottom of the soybean plant and move their way up. And so sometimes people can end up missing soybean loopers because they're not sweeping deep enough in the canopy to actually pick them up. And they can be really, really tiny, almost see-through whenever they're in their first couple growth stages. Um, so you really need to you got to pay attention. If you start seeing a little bit of defoliation down in the bottom of the canopy, but you're not really picking up a lot in your sweep net, you might have to dig that sweep net down a little bit further in the plant to see if you can really pick up those soybean loopers, or use a drop cloth. Most people will still opt for a sweep net because it picks up, the other insect pests that are out there in the field, and it's still a pretty good indicator of having those soybean loopers out there. But like I said, this is a lot different than green cloverworm, and that's why it's important to know the difference between the different insect pests, between green cloverworm and soybean looper. Is you know if this was green cloverworms, I'd come back 5 days later, like I did in this picture, and we would probably still be at the same level of defoliation. With soybean looper, you leave them for a few days, like here, like this picture was taken on August 30th. This picture is taken in the exact same spot in the field on September 4th, just a few days later. And you can see how much defoliation those insects caused in that short amount of time. So soybean loopers can be really devastating, and you need to pay attention to them. If you start picking up, a decent amount of soybean loopers in the field, you're really going to want to get ahead of that defoliation and treat for them, because they can cause a lot of leaf feeding just within a week and end up reducing your yield. All right, getting into our number one insect pest in of soybeans in Arkansas is corn earworm. And the scientific name is Helicoverpa, but a lot of people refer to them as different names, and it's all the same insect. Depending on what they're feeding on, people call them different names. Corn earworm is probably the most common name that people call them, but they're also referred to as cotton bollworm, soybean podworm, tomato fruitworm, and sorghum headworm. Now, this insect pest has 4 pairs of prolegs, but there's a lot of other insects that have 4 pairs of prolegs as well. And we'll get into a little bit more on how to exactly identify them from those other insects that have 4 pairs of prolegs. This is what the adult looks like. And you see down here in the bottom right corner is actually an egg of corn earworm. And this picture was actually taken in a cotton field, but they look the same whether they're in a cotton field or a soybean field. But whenever you're out scouting a crop, it's good to pay attention to what moths that you're seeing out there in the field, because even though that's not the damaging stage of that particular insect, the adults are what's laying eggs out there in the field, and they can give you a good idea of what's to come the next time you come scouting around. So, it's really good to take note of what insect adults or what moths that you're seeing out there in the field. This is an example of kind of what their damage looks like. Now, if they do occur earlier in the season, prior to the reproductive growth stages, they can actually cause a substantial amount of defoliation on some late planted soybeans is typically where we see them cause defoliation issues. They're primarily feeders on flowers and pods, soybean pods. And this is an example of what their feeding looks like on those soybean pods. But they're often found during the first, couple weeks following bloom. They can occur a little bit later in the season, but typically once you get into, the R5 growth stages of soybeans and beyond, you don't run into corn earworms too much anymore. Generally, they just like to feed on those reproductive structures, blooms, and small seeds within a pod. And a lot of times they're associated with open canopies on beans. So a lot of times if you have early planted soybeans and those canopies get lapped up, most of the time corn earworm doesn't get into beans with a good lapped up canopy. Although it can happen, and I've seen it happen several times. But really, if you have that open canopy in the field, that canopy's not closed up, shaded out the rest of it, most of the time that's where you run into some corn earworms. Or if you have, drilled beans that are thin, a lot of times on those late drilled beans that didn't get a really good stand, you'll run into a lot of corn earworms. Now, again, this is a migratory insect pest like soybean looper, and we get a lot of these from the lower Rio Grande Valley. And I'm just kind of showing you this because a lot of our storms throughout the summertime actually come from that lower Rio Grande Valley, and we get a lot of wind that blows those moths up into the south, up into Arkansas. And that's typically when we get a big moth flight that will infest soybeans or cotton. But what we do, we have these heart stack traps out for monitoring bollworm flights in Arkansas. And, I'll show you a chart kind of when they occur and what those numbers look like coming into, Arkansas here in a minute. But this is a useful tool if we know we have a bunch of bollworms in the area, a bunch of bollworm moths in the area. We know to be scouting for eggs on that crop, or just checking, things like soybeans a little more closely for those worms in the future. And those worms can be really, really small, and so it's really important to check the real bottom of your sweep net whenever you're scouting, looking for those really tiny bollworms that have just hatched out. So this is an example of what an average trap count may look. This is data from Lone Oak County, Arkansas in 2016, 17, and 18. And you can see we have typically we get what we call the 4th of July flight, and you can see this in 16 and 17, where our moth numbers really peaked those 2 years, really close towards the end of June. However, this is like 2018. They can occur, earlier in the growing season. But what I will tell you about that is that the first thing that these moths go to is if there's silking corn in the area, it's like a 99% chance that those moths are going to be going to lay their eggs on corn. That's why we primarily call them corn earworm. They like corn more than anything else. If there's silking corn in an area, it's more than likely that they are going to be laying eggs on corn. If there's not any silken corn in the area, though, they are liable to be going to soybeans or cotton in the area. And all in this, you can look at a bunch of corn silks, especially when they start turning a little bit of color, and you can see these eggs. This was a year where we had a really heavy moth flight. You see, it was not uncommon to get multiple eggs per silk out here in a lot of these fields. And that kind of gives you an indicator of what kind of soybean or what kind of moth population you're looking at, and what your what your worms may look like in the future. If I'm seeing a whole lot of eggs on a bunch of corn silks, we don't recommend treating them on corn because they generally don't cause a lot of yield loss, but we kind of know that that might be what's going to go into soybeans the next year. So if these worms all live in a cotton field or in a cornfield, and once they go through their reproductive life cycle, these eggs will hatch out. The larvae will end up feeding on corn, and they'll drop off of those plants. They'll turn into pupae, and then those moths emerge. Well, by the time those moths emerge, they are not looking to go back on the corn because most of the corn's past the point that they want to eat it anymore. Then that second generation is then going into soybeans and cotton fields. So a lot of times it's that second generation that really gets into soybeans. So how to really ID corn earworm? You know, like I said before, they got 4 sets of prolegs, but so do a lot of other caterpillars that we encounter in a soybean field. But a lot of times when you pick them up, they curl up into the C shape. You see a lot of these worms that I've swept up in this net are curled up in this C shape, and that's pretty indicative of having a bollworm. They also, when they get a little bit larger, have a really orange head capsule. And you can see that in a lot of a lot of these worms. So that's pretty indicative that it's a corn earworm. When they're a little bit smaller, though, it's a little bit harder to tell, but you can see kind of they've got a lot of these black spots up and down their body, and they've got like a slight hairiness to them, which some other caterpillars can be hairy, some of them can be pretty smooth. Now you look at this is a salt marsh caterpillar, and you go, oh, well, yeah, I got that down. There's no way I could, confuse a salt marsh caterpillar with any other insect pest out in the soybean field. It's big and hairy. There's no way I could mess that up. Well, when they're pretty small, they can look pretty similar to some other insect pests that we encounter. Now, again, how do we identify which one of these is a salt marsh caterpillar and which one is a corn earworm? Well, look at when these worms are really small. Sometimes you can hold a salt marsh caterpillar up to the light, kind of up to the sun, up to the sky, and you can see the light shining through the hairs on it, and you can kind of start telling that's a salt marsh caterpillar there. A lot of really fine hairs on them. But this bollworm also still has that orange head capsule. And it's really important to know the difference between the salt marsh caterpillar and bollworm because, bollworms are relatively expensive to control, whereas you can control salt marsh caterpillar with a lot cheaper insecticides. And they just generally aren't a large insect pest in soybeans. They can cause some defoliation occasionally, like we saw this past year. But generally they'll eat some leaves out in a soybean field, but generally don't occur in high enough populations to need treatment. Velvetbean caterpillar over here on the left side is another insect, another caterpillar that you'll come in contact with occasionally in a soybean field that has 4 sets of prolegs. And compared to corn earworm, a lot of people get these confused. I get calls late in the growing season that guys think they have earworms out in a soybean field, but really it's velvetbean caterpillar. Velvet beans will occur typically at the very end of the growing season, kind of like soybean loopers. Whereas corn earworm, they occur during the reproductive growth stages of soybeans. So a lot of times it's when these soybeans are blooming. Later in the growing season, you may start to pick up velvetbean caterpillars, and they aren't really common. There's areas within the state that seem to get velvetbean caterpillars more often than other areas of the state. But if it's R2 blooming soybeans, a lot of times it's corn earworm, and towards the end of the season, if you're picking up a caterpillar that's got that's got 4 prolegs, and there's quite a few of them out there, a lot of times it's velvetbean caterpillar. Velvetbean caterpillar also, like green cloverworm, thrashes really violently whenever you touch them, just trying to get away from whatever's attacking them. whereas corn earworm, again, is curling up in this C shape. And again, this is another one that you really need to be able to tell the difference between, because a lot of the insecticides used to control corn earworm are really expensive, whereas you can control velvetbean caterpillar with a lot cheaper insecticides at some minimal rates. So you could end up saving a grower, a lot of money by correctly identifying what caterpillar they have out there in the field. All right, we'll move into stink bugs a little bit, and there's several different species of stink bugs that you'll encounter in a soybean field. Brown stink bugs, green stink bugs, red-banded stink bugs, especially if you're in Louisiana, is a lot more common and a lot more serious of a pest than all these other stink bugs shown on here. Southern green stink bug can be pretty problematic in some years. And then red-shouldered stink bug is one that's not so much a pest, but it kind of almost just adds to some of these other pests whenever you're picking them up in a field. You'll typically encounter just a couple of them here and there. And then spine soldier bug, which spine soldier bug is actually a beneficial insect. And people will get confused thinking that they are brown stink bugs. And you can see how people get them confused just looking between those pictures, but they're actually beneficial. And if you look at them really closely, they've got these spines, these really sharp spines up on their shoulders, whereas a brown stink bug, they're not so sharp up here. They've also got a lot more robust mouth part for piercing the exoskeleton of other insects. And they just don't occur typically in the numbers that brown stink bugs occur in out in the field. So this is kind of an example. So all these stink bugs cause similar injury, and they mainly attack soybeans. Once you get up past the R5 growth stage, typically where I find them is the most advanced soybeans within an area. So if you've got a soybean field that was planted, a week before everything else in an area, that's typically where I start to pick up on stink bugs. Stink bugs are very sensitive to growth stage, and if they can find a soybean that's a little bit farther along than everything else in an area, they are really going to start hammering down on that field and really kind of flock to it. So those are typically where you start picking up on some stink bugs, is that earliest planted field that's farthest along. They can cause, young seeds to be malformed. They can completely get rid, if they feed on a really small seed, that seed will just abort. Once they start feeding on later on in the growing season on bigger soybean seeds, they just start causing this wrinkled appearance and can really end up reducing seed quality. You see how all this seed is really wrinkled. And it's just not going to fill out to be a good soybean. And you can end up, if you split these soybeans apart, you can see these puncture marks, whereas stink bug did feed on the soybean. And if you get enough of them in the field, they can delay maturity and cause green bean syndrome. Those beans won't properly dry down if you get enough of them out there in a field. And it really becomes hard for a grower to harvest it, and those beans just don't want to dry down, and they can cause some yield losses that way, just from those just poor harvest, harvestability later on in the growing season. So red-banded stink bug, whenever we look at them, red-banded stink bug, they lay their eggs in this in a row of two, so always red-banded stink bugs lay their eggs like this. Rice stink bug does too, but they are only pest of grass, crops. But this is the only one that you're really going to come in contact with out in a soybean field that lays their eggs in two rows like this. The nymphs have this little pattern on their back, this alternating kind of red and black pattern on their back. And then the adults generally have a red stripe across their back, as you see in this picture. Um, and I'll show you the difference between them and red-shouldered stink bugs, because sometimes it's hard for people to distinguish between them. The key identifying characteristic for red-banded stink bug is the spine that runs up in between their hind legs, and it's a pretty big spine. So if you pick up some of these and you're unsure whether it's a red-shouldered stink bug or a red-banded stink bug, you can flip that stink bug over, and if it's got that big spine in between its legs, it's definitely a red-banded stink bug. You see over here, this is a difference between a red-banded stink bug and a red-shouldered stink bug. And they'll look a little different. They don't all look exactly like they do in this picture. Some of them have a brighter red stripe going across their back. You see this red-banded stink bug kind of has a yellow stripe going across its back. But you also see that this red-shouldered stink bug actually has some shoulders, it looks like there. Whereas a red-banded stink bug, it's pretty smoothed off, around right here. And something I always take note of, red-banded stink bug pretty commonly has these two little black dots right here on their back as well, whereas red-shouldered stink bug doesn't. Red-banded stink bugs, they're a tropical insect that, they overwinter down in South Louisiana. They really don't have a diapause, so they don't just go hide under leaf litter and sit there all winter long and then, in the spring come back out. They may go and get under some leaf litter if it gets cold, but as soon as it warms back up, like a warm day like it is today here in Arkansas, those stink bugs will actually come out and they will try to feed again. But, you know, if you have a really cold winter, like we did this year, we had quite a few days. I think we had about 4 days where it never got above freezing in Arkansas. That's going to knock back that red-banded stink bugs. They're really, really susceptible to cold winters. We had a few stink bugs, a few red-banded stink bugs in South Arkansas this year, but with this cold stretch as we had this winter in Arkansas, it's really going to knock those red-banded stink bugs farther down south. It's really going to kill a lot of them out of Arkansas. We're really likely not to have any this next year. So, just with that, taken into account, I just know that, if I get a picture of a stink bug, it's more than likely not going to be a red-banded stink bug in that picture. It's more than likely going to be a red-shouldered stink bug if you had a really cold winter and you're not in South Louisiana. Something to kind of take account of also with red-banded stink bug, they are more damaging than other stink bugs. They have a more potent salivary enzyme than our other stink bugs. And that ends up causing more damage on soybeans. And they also reproduce a lot faster than some of our other stink bugs. They have a lot of overlapping generations, 4 to 8 per year. So that means you're going to have adults. You may have new nymphs out in the field, large size nymphs, eggs. All the growth stages is what we're talking about whenever you have overlapping generations of insects. And this causes quicker reinfestation of fields. A lot of times with this insect pest, you may spray a field and they'll be back in that field, a week later if you're in an area with a really, really high red-banded stink bug population. And that's not common with our other stink bugs. A lot of times if you treat for a field of, brown stink bugs or green stink bugs, that's the only time you're going to have to do it for those insect pests. They don't reinfest fields nearly as quickly as red-banded stink bug. Brown stink bugs, they're a stink bug that's brown. I mean, it's pretty easy to identify these. People get a little confused between some different stink bug, nymphs because they do look different. But I will say that brown stink bug is generally harder to kill than a lot of our other stink bug pests. Pyrethroids don't work on them near as well. It's generally things like acephate that do a lot better. But here's the difference that you really need to know between brown stink bug and spine soldier bug. As I was talking earlier, people get these confused very commonly because they do look really, really similar. Um, like I said before, these spine soldier bugs have a really sharp spine on their soldiers, whereas these brown stink bugs really don't. It's not near as sharp. And if you flip them over, the spine soldier bugs got a lot larger mouth part than these brown stink bugs. You can also see the difference in the eggs. These spine soldier bugs kind of have a crown of spikes around the top of their eggs, whereas brown stink bugs don't. And like I said, look at how robust that mouth part is, that proboscis on that on this spine soldier bug compared to a brown stink bug. See, it's much more narrow, made for feeding on, soybeans, softer things, whereas these spine soldier bugs have a lot more robust mouth part that's made for piercing through insects' exoskeletons. And that's why there's that difference between them. Brown stink bugs, the nymphs are kind of a yellow to tan color. They're brown. They have a brown pronotum, and they got these brown dots kind of running down their middle. And I always see a little bit of kind of red speckling through there on some really small ones. But you can just see the difference on how these different instars progress on this brown stink bug, on these brown stink bug nymphs, and they generally kind of are this yellowish brown color, which I'll show you kind of the other stink bugs and how to ID them. As these brown stink bugs get a little older, you can see the difference. They've got these little spots on top of these eggs as they get a little older, whereas these freshly laid eggs are just purely yellow. Um, like I said, sweep net is how we sample for these brown stink bugs. We treat when counts reach 9 bugs per 25 sweeps, and that's pretty common. I actually meant to cut this out, so you might want to just cut this section out
Okay.
because it's different for the different states. All right, green stink bugs. So, I mean, this is a pretty easy insect to identify. I mean, it's a stink bug that's green, aptly named. And you can tell the difference. These aren't so hard to ID. I don't feel like these nymphs are so hard to ID compared to some of the other nymphs that you see. They're just have these kind of black and white stripes across their abdomen when they're really small. And then they start to get this more green color, and they'll get a little orange up closer to on their shoulders right here. And this is kind of what the fifth instar looks like, and you can see those wings starting to develop right here. But generally, they've kind of got a green color to them, especially when they get a little larger. Whereas those brown stink bugs kind of stay that yellowy color. The adults are, I mean, they're green. They're kind of easy to identify. You can get them confused with southern green stink bugs, but the control of both these pests is pretty similar, and so it's not a big issue if you kind of get green stink bug and southern green stink bug mixed up generally. These are what the eggs look like. Again, you can kind of age these eggs when they're freshly laid. Again, they're kind of a yellowy color, whereas when they get a little older, they start getting this color to them. But all stink bug eggs, are kind of this barrel shape and pretty indicative of. So just generally, this is kind of a conclusion slide for just comparing the differences between these different stink bugs and what to expect out of each species, and how to distinguish just kind of control options between them. And you can kind of read through that and see what these differences are. Again, a lot of these insects like greens. They only go through a couple generations per year, but southern green stink bugs, they actually go through quite a few. They go through several more generations and can repopulate a field quite a bit faster than green stink bugs. Brown stink bugs are a little bit more difficult to control than our green stink bugs and red-shouldered stink bugs, and even really red-banded stink bugs. Red-banded stink bugs aren't necessarily hard to control. Um, you can kill them with a lot of insecticides. But the problem is they really reinfest the field, and we generally recommend tank mixes for them because you get a little bit longer residual control out of that. But this just kind of gives you a general overview of these different stink bug species and how they kind of act out in a soybean field. But with that, that kind of covers a lot of the common insect pests of soybeans in Arkansas. And, if you ever need me or you got any questions on this presentation, feel free to contact me or one of my other colleagues in Arkansas, and we'll do our best to help, clear up any questions you got. I mean, it's our job, so don't, hesitate to contact us. But with that, thank you very much for listening. And again, contact me if you got any questions.